Hey, welcome to a new Tuts Plus course. I'm Adi, and in this course, we're exploring something called container queries. Now, when I first heard this term, I was like, what? What's a container query? Well, it's like a media query, but for containers. Essentially, you can use this new feature in CSS to style an element differently based on its parent size or its container size. So not viewport size like media queries, but container size or parent size. These are container queries. And maybe at first it doesn't sound like such a big deal, but actually they're very, very powerful, as you'll see in the next few lessons. So in this course, you'll learn about an existing problem with media queries, how to fix that with container queries, and we'll also explore these in more detail by creating a more complex demo. Now, if you've never heard about container queries, don't worry, they're super new. So not a lot of people know about them. In fact, they're so new that currently a single browser supports them, and that's Chrome Canary, the experimental version of Chrome. Yeah, and they're under a flag also. So please don't yell at me for talking about experimental CSS or CSS that's not ready for production, because I have a very good reason. I believe this new feature in CSS, container queries, is so powerful that it's going to be implemented very, very soon. And it won't be experimental for much longer. In fact, if you're watching this course later than 2021, when it was recorded, then they might already be implemented and supported by all major browsers, which is fantastic. But until then, I believe we should learn about this new feature right now, learn how to use it, and prepare for when it's finally going to be released. With that said, I think we should get started. But first, a message from Envato Elements. With one subscription, you'll have unlimited access to WordPress themes and plugins, web and email templates, UI kits, and more. There are millions of digital assets to choose from. They have simple commercial licensing, and you can cancel anytime. Subscribe now using the link in the video description. All right, now let's talk about container queries. That's coming up next. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, we're discussing a problem you might encounter when trying to make certain components responsive by using media queries. Let's begin. All right, so I'm in CodePen, and I made a quick demo to show you what I mean. Let's assume that I have a typical blog layout with a sidebar and a main area. And I want to display this, let's call it widget or element, with the author biography in both places. I want the component in the sidebar to look like this, and I want the one in the main window or in the main area to look like this, right? I just made this quick sketch in Figma. So big difference, right? Where I have more space, like the main area here, I want to use this version of the component. When I have less space, I want to use this version, right? Because it works better on or in areas with smaller widths. So how do I do that? Well, the easiest thing to do would be to create two versions of this in CSS by using a class. And I did just that. I created a class of large that I'm going to apply to the second element. So it's all good so far, right? But how do I show this larger version only when there's enough room for it? Because right now, if I'm going to resize this viewport, I'm still getting the big version. Well, the answer to that would be media queries, right? But how do I do this with media queries? Because with media queries, I can't just remove a class from an element unless there's some JavaScript involved, but that's overcomplicating things. I could like get rid of this second class approach and just write a media query where I target the actual elements and I change them, but that's going to change both elements. And then you might say, okay, but you can target just the element in the aside or in the main. Correct. Let's say I do target the element in the main, but that won't solve my problem because I might have certain screen sizes where the viewport or the media query is going to kick in and it's going to show me either the small or the large version. But maybe in some situations, I want to show the large version even on smaller screens when there's room. How do I do that? That's really the problem, because when you're using media queries, you're just tied to the viewport width. What if I want my component to change its style based on the size, or in this case, the width of its parent element? Wouldn't that be much better and much easier to manage? In our case exactly, I have the exact same element in both places. But how can I make this same element to be displayed differently on the aside, which is much smaller in size, or on the main, which is much bigger in size? Currently, we can't really do that with media queries. Or maybe we can, but it's going to take a lot of effort. Well, the answer to this problem is with CSS container queries. All right, so that's the problem, basically. And media queries don't really help us right here, but container queries can help us. And in fact, they solve the problem entirely. Let me show you how you can solve the problem using container queries in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how we can fix the problem that I showed you previously by using container queries. Let's begin. All right, so we are back in CodePen with the exact same code that I showed you in the previous lesson. The difference is that I switched browsers. I'm now using Chrome Canary, and if you want to follow along, I recommend you download and install Chrome Canary as well. I'm doing this because, as I was saying in the introduction to this course, this feature currently only works in Chrome Canary. It's an experimental feature. So to make it work in Chrome Canary, this sits under a flag. So you would need to go to Chrome and then flags and search for CSS container queries. As you can see, mine is enabled right here, and you need to do the same in order for it to work properly. So now, container queries, as I was saying, will look at the size of a container or a parent element to determine what changes need to be made. So for our code here, let's go ahead and define a parent to this about element, because this is the one that we want to change, basically, right? So let's go ahead and do that, and I'm just gonna undo this, and then I'm gonna delete the large class from our second element here. I'm gonna repeat the same process by encasing this in a container element. And by the way, you can name this this container element whatever you want. I put container because it's easier to understand, but you can call it banana, for example. It doesn't really matter. We're doing all of the targeting in CSS, so it doesn't matter if it's called container or something else entirely. All right, so as you saw, by removing that large class, these elements now share the same style. So let's go to CSS, and we're going to scroll down here, where it says small style, this is where we'll start our container queries. These styles that you see here are the default styles, right? They are for the small version of the element. And the ones that were here under large will be for the other state of the element, the bigger one. But first things first, in order to get started with container queries, there are two parts. First, you need to define the element that will be queried, right? The actual container. In other words, we need to define, let's call it a containment context. And that's going to let the browser know which element, which container to query and how to query it. The syntax here is pretty simple. We're going to target our element, container or banana or whatever you called it. And you would say container type, and we're going to specify inline size. So inline size basically tells us that we want to query the container's width or inline dimension. There will be an available property value in the form of block size to query the block dimension, but currently only inline size is implemented, or at least at the time of this recording. So container type, inline size. This is part one of working with container queries. Part two is defining a container rule. Very much like a media query, we would do the following: at container, and we need to specify a breakpoint. In my case, let's say min width 30 rems. And inside, we're basically going to add all the changes that we want to do to the descendants of our container. So that's very important. Let's paste these in here. And in order for this to work, we do need to make small changes. We no longer have that large class, so we can actually get rid of it entirely. So about avatar. Here I'm going to target the header, the H1, and then the social icons. Cool. All right. Let's save and let's give this a shot. And there we go. So when our container, which we defined previously as the element with the class of container, but you know what, just so this is not too confusing, let me call this banana. Okay, and then we say banana, and it still works, right? So whatever you want to call that container is of little importance. So when our container element goes over 30 rems, we start applying these styles, right? And we get the second version here. See how that changes? And you might say that, okay, Adi, but you're still changing the viewport size. Well, I'm changing the viewport size because these elements are directly linked to that. So changing the viewport size changes the width of the element. That doesn't really matter. For example, I can target, let's say, the banana, and I can say resize horizontal, and I can say overflow hidden. Auto. There we go. And now I can resize this element like so. Right? I'm not changing the viewport, but instead I'm resizing the element. And you see that when the element gets smaller, or when the container gets smaller, the container query kicks in and we get the initial version of our component. How cool is that? This opens up a whole new world of possibilities when creating responsive websites, because we no longer need to rely on media queries to create multiple versions of an element. For example, a navbar that can have 3 different versions for mobile, tablet, and desktop, right? We can easily create that or create those versions with container queries. It's a super, super powerful feature. Now, let me just get rid of this resize, because I think you understood that container queries have nothing to do with the actual viewport size. I just used those to demonstrate a point. But yeah, that's the basic syntax of using container queries. 2 parts. Again, you define a containment context by saying container type and then inline size. And then you set up a container rule that takes a breakpoint basically. And in here, you can define the styles that will be applied to the descendants of that container. Okay, so in our case, these styles are applied to the descendants of banana. And that fixes the problem that we had earlier, right? In the problem that I showed in the previous video. Now, with container queries, we can have the same element in 2, 3, 5, 20 different places. And depending on the size of the parent of where that element is, it's going to look one way or the other. And we can control everything with CSS. And there you have it, a super elegant solution to our problem by using container queries. Now, I wish these were already implemented in major browsers, because it would make creating responsive websites so much easier. But they're not yet, at least at the time of this recording. But I have my hopes up that they will be implemented very, very soon. Now, the demo that I showed you here is a pretty simple one, and I think you'll be able to understand the power of this new feature in CSS by working on a more complex example, something that you might have encountered before. So let me show you a more complex example in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, we'll build a more complex demo for container queries. Let's begin. First of all, let me show you what I want to create. So it's going to be a page with several articles displayed in a grid format. And depending on the size of the parent or the container for each article, I can have 3 variations. So this is the largest article, this is a middle or a medium size, and this is a small size. Okay, now based on that, I went ahead and created this in CodePen. I wrote all the HTML, and by the way, you can find the links to these pens below the video. And I wrote the HTML in the following way. I'm going to have the articles placed on different rows, and each row is represented by a div class grid. Each article is represented by the div with the class of article card, and these article cards are wrapped in an article tag. So this is basically our parent or our container. This is the one that we're going to query. In CSS, I went ahead and wrote just some basic styling for what you see so far. And I left the rest of the CSS to write together right now. And we're going to start with the grid. And I chose this example for a very good reason, because with grid, you can create some pretty amazing layouts thanks to something called AutoFit. And AutoFit will allow the grid to automatically make items bigger or smaller depending on the available space. So in our case, I'm going to say grid. I'm going to set display to grid. And then this is where the magic happens. Grid template columns, I'm going to say repeat, autofit, and that's actually with a hyphen, min-max, 200 pixels, 1FR. And we're also going to set a gap, let's say of 3 rems, and I'm going to set a margin bottom of 3 rems as well. So based on that, our layout now currently looks like this. The first row has only 1 article because that's how I set it up in HTML. And let me actually show you like this. Let me collapse. See? So first row, 1 article, second row, 2 articles, third row, 4 articles. And that can be seen like this. See? This is the second row, and this is the third row. And Grid does its best to place these items correctly depending on the available space. Right, now let's work on the smaller size first, which is this one. Here we just have an image, title, and this this meta information with author and date. So we'll say small. This is the default, right? Let's start by defining our containment context, container, type, inline size. And while we're here, actually, let me show you 2 other options for creating a containment context. You can also name a container. So you can say container name, articles, and then you would say container, articles, and then min width, 30 rems, whatever it is, and you would write your CSS there. Or you can use a shorthand, and that is simply container, the type, inline size, and then slash the name, right? These 2 are exactly the same. So let's go with that. Next, I'm going to target the article content. And what I need to do here is move this bit to the bottom. So I need to use the order in Flexbox. So I'm going to say display flex and set column as the direction. And then I'm going to target meta and say order equals 1. And it's gonna put it right below that. Next, let's target the meta UL. A couple of different styles here. List style none to get rid of these bullet points. Let's reset padding, margin, and let's set a display to flex so they're one next to each other. Let's also change the font size, 14 pixels, and line height, 16 pixels. Okay, so that's pretty much all we're gonna do to the meta. We gotta hide this this science label and this description. So I'm gonna say h1 plus p, so the paragraph immediately following h1, and also the label display none. And then finally h1, let's set a much lower font size, 18 pixels. Let's set a line height, 24 pixels, and a margin, 1 rem, top, bottom, 0, left, right. All right, so that completes the CSS for the default state, right? If we look at the page, every single article has the same style. Now let's move on to the medium. So for the medium style, and it doesn't mean that this medium style will be applied to the second row. It's going to be applied where it's necessary, where the container query dictates that it's necessary. So I'm going to say container articles, and I'm going to set a min width of, let's say, 40 rems. Now, for the medium, so when there's more space available, we're going to use this version. So image on the left, and we display everything else, the description here, the label, and the meta is also back at the top. Really easy to do. We're going to say article card. We're going to display flex, and we're going to set a gap of 2 rems. And I'm doing this so that, let's see where it is, right here, so that the image and the text content are in line. Then let's make the image smaller. So figure, we'll set a max width of 20 rems, let's say, and we're going to align it to the top. So flex start. What else? Let's display the paragraph after the H1 and the label. So display block. And finally, we're going to target the meta. We're going to change the order back to 0, so it's going to be placed on the top. And we're going to set the display to flex here as well. So all of these elements are one next to the other. Let's center align them vertically. So align items, center, like so. And let's set a gap of 1 rem. All right. So now we have the second version of our component. So this is the default. This is the second one. Notice if we increase the available space here, we might, almost. Let's change this just a little bit to 38 rems, let's say. Maybe 35. Maybe 30. There we go. See? So when the parent is at least 30 rems, which happens right about now, these two elements on the second row change to this medium size version. Of course, it doesn't look very good here. It should be a little bit bigger, this minimum width, but I just wanted to show you that really quick. In this first row, where the article parent is at least 40 rems, we get the updated version, of course. The rest gets the default version. And now finally, for the large version, I'm going to say container articles min width. I'm going to set this to like a bigger value, like 60 rems. And the larger version needs to look something like this. So the content itself is positioned above the image. We also have a color overlay on the image. And apart from this version, we also have this little icon next to the date there. So let's quickly go over and write the necessary styles. I'm going to start by resetting the display of the article card, because previously we set it to flex. I want it to be displayed as a block. And I want a position relative because we're going to position some elements absolutely on there. Great. Next, let's target the figure. We'll set a max width, 100%, and also a position relative. And let me just bring this down just a little bit so we can see the changes happen here in real time. There we go. Next, I want to add that color overlay, and a simple way to do that is with a pseudo element on the figure. So I'm going to set content to nothing, position absolute, top 0, left 0. I'm going to set a width to 100%, height, same deal. And I'm just going to add a background color to an RGBA value of 14126 with a 0.8 or 80% opacity, just like that. Cool. Now that's taken care of. Let's move on to the article content. That's going to be absolutely positioned above the image. So article content, position absolute, and let's set the left and bottom to 8 rems. Like so. Next, let's target the H1, change the font size on that. 44 pixels. Line height is 56 pixels, and let's make it white. Next, let's also make the paragraph white. Next, let's target the H1 and the paragraph following an H1 and set their width to about 75%. Like that. And let's see what else. We got to hide the author. So author, display none. And what else? Let's add this this icon. That's really easy to do. I went ahead and imported Font Awesome version 5. So for that we do time. We'll use a pseudo element for it. Content. That's going to be F017. Font family is going to be Font Awesome 5 free. And let's also give it a margin right of, let's say, 0.5 rems. Cool. So now we have the icon too. And with that, we're actually finished. Let's go ahead and save. And let me change the view here. So we can see all the articles in a regular sized page. So for this first article, notice the parent is really large. It passes this minimum that we set here of 50 rems. So it uses the large style. The parents of the articles in the second row have that space cut in half. So they're not using the large version, they're using the medium version. And then finally, the other 4 articles are using the default version because their parents have limited width. And just like that, we've successfully used container queries to create 3 different versions of an element based on the parent size, not the viewport size, right? We didn't use any kind of media queries. We just use container queries that target the direct size of the container. Super powerful. And now, of course, as I make this smaller, the containers for each article get smaller and smaller. So they will update as well. Notice the middle row articles are now using the default style. And as I go smaller and smaller, you'll notice the top article will also use the middle or the medium style. And I can go as low as I want, and everything will just go back to the default style that we set previously. All right, folks, that's a quick introduction to CSS container queries. Do you like them? I do. I believe they are super powerful, and I can't wait until they are implemented and supported by all modern browsers. It's going to make creating responsive websites so much easier. Now, in this course, I only showed you these 2 examples, but there are so many more implementations for this kind of thing. Off the top of my head, maybe a search bar that can be displayed in a hero area as well as in a sidebar. Maybe a nav bar that has 3 different states for mobile, tablet, desktop. The examples can go on, and I urge you to play around with this new feature in CSS with container queries and see for yourself what they can do and how great they are. All the links to the code that I showed you in this course can be found below the videos in the lesson descriptions, and you can use that code to play around or start your own. It's really up to you. With that said, thank you very much for watching this course. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care.